Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges, and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. Whether you're working on local adaptation projects, planning for climate risk, or simply looking for hope backed by science, you're in the right place. If you enjoy these conversations, be sure to follow the podcast and subscribe wherever you listen. Share with your friends and colleagues too. Anyone interested in building a more resilient future. Now, let's jump into today's episode.
Hello, I'm Laura, one of the producers of the Climate Resilience Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're bringing you something a little different, a highlights episode featuring clips from some of our most insightful conversations. So whether you're new to the show or a long-time listener, this is a great way to catch up on key ideas and conversations you might have missed, or simply to reflect on them in a new way. So let's jump in and relive some of the best bits of the Climate Resilience Podcast so far. First up, we're going to hear from Kat Cornfield, Social Equity Senior Advisor at the Environment Agency, and Lucy Formoy, JBA's Social Value and Engagement Lead, exploring the critical role of social value in building whole society resilience to climate change from episode 7.
Well, really, social value aims to not only bring the short-term benefits, but it brings those lasting changes as well. And we know that resilience is also a long-term strategy, don't we? So, and from the Environment Agency's perspective, our climate ambition is to be a nation ready for and resilient to climate change. And delivery of this isn't just about the number of properties we can protect through the work that we do. It's about the schemes and the projects that deliver better and more integrated outcomes. It's about outcomes that allow the whole of society to become more aware of their risk, be able to adapt and have capacity to respond and recover more effectively. And it's about outcomes that seek to enhance social capital, human capital, natural capital, and the resilience of our assets, infrastructure, and our systems. So the social value we can deliver on projects can hugely support this through the creation of lasting and wider benefits. And these benefits are rooted in a sense of place, so very much focused on the individual areas and communities that we live in, but also crucially with equity in mind. So one of the most important things to note here is that by ensuring we listen to the needs of all the members of our communities, and particularly those people who have the smallest voices, and by supporting people to release the blockers that will enable them to become more resilient, we can contribute to a more equitable society and generate better outcomes for people and nature. So they're very, very closely linked, I think, resilience and social value.
Yeah, and I think just picking up on your point, Kat, around being rooted in that sense of place, and really kind of, responding to what that community needs. I think it really highlights the importance of getting a good local and needs assessment to build a picture of what that community actually needs. So this would be kind of collecting their, things like demographics, information, existing social networks, understanding what organisations are operating in that place. And I think when we can really get under the skin of what that, what is that community really needs, that's when we can deliver real social value and resilience as well. And I think, we can use our social value activities as a tool for increasing resilience if done properly, and if it's what that community needs, and if you're working with those existing networks and groups within that community that you will have highlighted through your local needs assessment.
Yeah, and if we're talking about what the community needs, we know that not everybody is the same. Not everybody's equal. We know that the poorest people in society are more affected by the effects of climate change. So if we talk about social equity and a just transition, we should be working with communities and groups who need it the most and ensure that the whole of society is resilient to climate change. And in our industry, we've got this great opportunity, haven't we, to create a fairer transition to the changing climate and, to the changing net zero goals as well. And in the EA, we've been developing our sustainability strategy with a group of fair transition champions. These are staff volunteers from within our organisation who can share lived experiences and perspectives from a range of their communities. And their insights have really helped us be able to develop a practical understanding of what we can achieve through social value to support resilience within the community. So we really, we can really target some of our social value interventions based on that lived experience from those fair transition champions. So I think that's a really key thing, is ensuring that the communities have their voice and have their say.
In this next clip from episode 10, Phil is joined by Claire Francis, Area Flood and Coastal Risk Manager for the Environment Agency, Solent and South Downs, along with JBA's Richard Chubb, Associate Director, and Alec Dane, Chartered Civil Engineer. Together, they explore the shift towards greater shared responsibility and the role the whole of society has to play in safeguarding people from the impacts of our changing climate.
What are some of the shifts and big shifts that you think are important and you'd like to see in respect of assets and resilience?
Thanks, Phil, and really interesting to hear Alec and Richard's and your own thoughts, particularly around the asset management space. And I completely agree that the investment piece and how things are changing and how we're starting to think differently is definitely recognised as kind of one of the key things, I guess, across the sector that will help us move forward. But I guess for me personally, if I think about some of the bigger shifts, and it's kind of to lift us up out of pure asset management, and it's mainstreaming resilience and adaptation. And I think we've all used those words in different ways across this conversation, but really understanding that how we manage risk, how we manage the impact of a changing climate, the changing coast on our kind of communities and places, is not just going to be about asset management going forward. That will clearly has been and will continue to be a really important part of flood risk and coastal risk management. But I don't think it can be the whole solution, and we need to start looking at those things much more in combination. So again, pointing back to the National FCOM strategy and just thinking of its vision statement, which is a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow, and to the year 2100. We really need to start future-proofing some of our kind of decision-making, some of our planning, and thinking about how do we do that, taking into account the challenges that we know we've got and the role that actually a lot of people need to play in that. That's not just one organisation can't make a place resilient. That's kind of public organisations, private organisations, businesses, communities, local places, local government. There's plenty of kind of work needing to be done to bring all of those strands together. So you mentioned some of those forms of resilience, Phil, and thinking about warning and forming. How do we increase the reach? How do we increase the understanding? How do we make that data more accessible? And there's been some really great things that have done. There's a lot more information out there now around kind of flood risk, what's happening with water levels. Gov.uk is a great place to find some of that information. And it's really, I guess, opening up that conversation so we're all much more comfortable talking about what flood risk means. How do we live with some of those changes? How do we adapt to what might be coming in the future? And how do we think a little bit differently around it? And again, that's how do we prepare for what's coming? How do we minimize the impact? So when flooding does happen, and as some of the data we've talked about, it shows it will keep happening and it will increasingly happen. So how do we make the impact of that less? And how do we recover quicker? So some of the kind of the phrases we use around building back better. How do we learn from what's gone before, and how do we enhance our ability to adapt to when it comes again? And again, we've talked about adaptation, and I think Alec mentioned adaptation strategies, particularly in some of the kind of innovation that the sector is doing around that. And that's not necessarily delivering a solution or an asset now that will be fit for purpose for 100 years, which is probably the more traditional way that we've talked about protection and flood defences. But how do we understand what is appropriate and proportionate now? That helps with that investment conversation. But also at what point, and how do we understand what might need to change in the future, and how do we design some of those approaches? How do we increase education, awareness, the ability for the wider society to get involved in flood risk management? How do we bring other voices into the conversation? So this isn't just, I guess, infrastructure delivery at its core. This is around how people respond to climate change. How do our environment and communities kind of work together to understand what that looks like? And there's some really exciting research happening in that space. We've certainly got the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme, which is delivering some great projects at the moment to try and test some of those theories and to develop that learning so we can embed that more widely. And that it's around just, I guess, accepting change and taking the opportunities that that's also going to bring for us. So yeah, for me, asset management is really important, but we need to put some of those other aspects with it too, because we won't get there, I think, unless we do it together.
Thanks. And Richard, I was going to say, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, some really excellent insights, Claire. And I think one of the things that you mentioned a number of times, and I think is so important, and the other podcasts have definitely covered this, but community engagement and getting the message out there, a clear message, I suppose, around what the issues are, what our choices are, and what our approach is to solving them. And it goes way beyond asset management. It needs to be a fully integrated policy. So making that clear. And then ultimately, it comes down to some difficult decisions that need to be made at the right time, need to be communicated, engaged upon at the right time. But ultimately, giving a clear plan of how we move forward to create more resilience across our asset base and the communities that are being protected by it, and all the services that go in between. So, yeah, it does come back to engagement and communication, getting that absolutely right. That's going to be so important in the next 10, 20 years as we start to have to make some, as we have been doing, but more so, some key decisions and show the pathway forward clearly. So yeah, just wanted to sort of bring that back to in what Claire just rung a bell with what Claire was saying to me.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And Claire, you used the phrase mainstreaming resilience, and I think that's a great sort of place to end, really, because resilience isn't and shouldn't be a synonym for what we have done before. Things are changing. There is a case for change, and that's in the language and the engagement that we undertake, as you alluded to, Richard, but also how we integrate across our various disciplines.
Next up, we hear from one of the UK's most influential voices in ethical agriculture, Guy Singh-Watson, founder and CEO of Riverford Organic Farmers, in this inspirational clip from episode 14.
So what gives you hope?
Well, nothing much around the climate. I mean, I'm not people who think, get excited that we'll be able to grow grapes in this country. And well, I mean, I have planted walnuts and hazelnuts and so on. So I suppose that is in prediction of climate change. But the biggest, I don't think really, we don't know what to expect, but we know that there are going to be more extremes and there's going to be more unpredictability. And when it comes to farming, there's nothing good in that, I'm afraid. So, the reality of the situation that we face doesn't give me much hope. Our, wisdom and willingness to deal with the challenges and make the intelligent decisions, when we look at it collectively, whether at a national level or an international level, is, severely lacking. So I don't have much hope there either. I mean, the public give me hope. I mean, but the public, all the research I read, really want to see change, and they are prepared to make some sacrifices for that change, but they desperately need some leadership for that to actually happen. And again, I'm afraid that is lacking. So I think we're being failed by our institutions, really.
So, Guy, you've used the phrase adaptation there a few times, and adaptation goes hand in hand with resilience. We talk about how they are interchangeable a lot at JBA and rely on each other. We can't build resilient, resilient communities or resilient farms or resilient landscapes unless we adapt. And we need to see those adaptations at a policy level, at a leadership level, in a community level as well. And so in the context of adaptation, then I'm really interested how we can build and create climate resilience landscapes. So how do you think farms can work together to create benefit and resilience beyond their own individual holding or boundary?
I think it's being able to share best practice, and what is recognized as best practice is definitely evolving. But being able to learn from your neighbours can help you to be a better farmer, and can help you to be a happier farmer. I think there is a sort of mental resilience as well, that one can be easily dragged down by, especially when you're in the fields on your own a lot, by what's happening and the challenges of farming and the challenges more broadly facing our planet. And I think working together and at least being able to share that is very important. So I did actually found a cooperative, 25 years ago, of organic growers in South Devon, which I think has been, tremendously sort of helpful. And I think probably the actual mutual support is in some ways the most important part of it. And then more recently, I have on the farm where my wife and I live now, we have essentially made it into a collective. So there are about 8 businesses here working quite closely together, working in their own very specialized fields. And I think that works well. I guess more broadly, I mean, clusters, we're being encouraged to form farm clusters to work on things like, catchment sensitive farming and so on. And provide, to produce wildlife corridors. There's a project in our valley to introduce beavers, which is so far, which you have to get everyone on board with. Not everyone is. Some people are quite concerned about it. I've just started a project to put some large wooden turbines up on a ridge. That would be working with a couple of neighbours and actually working with the whole community, and the energy would be sold into a local energy users club, what's not used by Riverford. So yeah, I'm a big fan of working together in all sorts of ways, and I really want to live in a collective world where people cooperate rather than the idea that we're always competing with each other. I don't think has served farmers very well.
Again, collaboration, working together is a very common theme from guests on the podcast. Thinking about this a little bit more, I was listening to your Desert Island Discs episode that you did. It was from a few years ago now. It was 2018, I think, something like that. But in it, you spoke about how you obviously you're unable to grow tomatoes sort of all year round, and you import them, I think, from Spain. So in terms of sort of that more international collaboration, different practices, how do you go about that, and what have you learned from more sort of further afield collaboration?
Well, I am a pragmatist. I mean, I would love it if we were all happy to eat, seasonal whatever's in season. But that's just not going to happen. I mean, we could eat a lot more seasonally than we do, but I just wouldn't have a business if we didn't have tomatoes available at least most of the time. And the season in the UK without using fossil heat in greenhouses, which in most cases means burning fossil fuels, is about 10 weeks if you're lucky, sometimes only 8. So the rest of the year we are importing from Spain, from Andalusia, for instance, and there are a couple of tomato growers down there who we've been working with for 20 years. And similarly, at the moment, we've got a lot of stone fruit coming in from mostly from northern Spain, actually. So we do have a group of about 30 growers, mostly from Spain and Italy and southern France, who allow us to maintain a reasonable variety of vegetables in our boxes throughout the year.
This next clip is from episode 15, where Phil was joined by Rob Gardner, CEO and co-founder of Rebalance Earth, for an inspiring conversation about the power and potential of nature-based solutions.
So, the bulk of my career has really been around pensions, which is, how do we save money today to make sure we have enough money when we retire, right? It's the ultimate in long-term thinking that, when you're 25, you put away a little bit of money so that when you're 65 or 70, you have enough to retire on. So it requires a completely different long-term mindset of 40, 50 years, which is very different to political time cycles and very different to company time cycles that are typically all about quarterly and annual results. So there's a sort of mindset philosophical approach. The second point is that pension fund capital has been used to fund a lot of infrastructure around the world. So the M6 toll road was actually funded by Australian pension funds. And when I was a pension fund consultant, I was involved back in 2010 in the early days of renewables and getting pension funds to invest in offshore wind and solar panels, which has been a key part of the energy transition. And so I think this long-term pool of money is an important building block in terms of how do we transition to this kind of more resilient country that we all want to talk about. And the second point in terms of why now is a lot of these pension funds, despite the political discourse coming from the US of being anti-climate change, anti-ESG, they are increasingly aware that climate change and nature loss is a clear and present danger in a tangible time horizon. So let me just give a couple of just hard-hitting sort of facts and figures just as a bit of a wake-up call. So the first is the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. So these are the people who guess, who figure out how long people will live and help calculate insurance and all the rest, have done some research and analysis, and they think up to 25% of global GDP is at risk in the next 25 years. Now, I started my career 25 years ago, and so the next 25 years in the context of a pension fund is around the corner. And just 25% of GDP, to put that in context, in the global financial crisis, which I lived through, GDP fell by about 6 or 7%, and that felt terrifying. In COVID, it fell by 11%, but fortunately, it sort of bounced back very quickly. So 25% is seriously bad for any investments you're making. It's also bad for the members that you're trying to take care of. Linked to that, Norges, which is the second largest pension fund and asset owner on the planet, with over $1 trillion invested, looked at the sort of climate models that a lot of people use and said these are too linear. They're not taking into account tipping points and sort of cascading impacts. And when we do that, how much of our US equity portfolio do we think could fall as a result of these? And they think it's round numbers between 20 to 30%. And so once you start thinking about those, and if you're a pension fund trustee or CIO, you've got to say, well, actually, I can't just assume that when I invest in my equities and bonds, the future will be the same as the past. And I need to start thinking forward and go, what if certain scenarios play out, and how would I invest differently? And the University of Exeter and the University Superannuation Scheme have done some brilliant work on sort of climate scenarios. The so what for your listeners is that these big pools of assets, these 50 billion, 100 billion, up to $1 trillion asset owners, now see climate change and nature risk as systemic financial risk to their portfolios, as well as risk to their members, and they want to do something about it. But in order to do something about it, they need to invest. And there's really sort of three things they can do. They can do sort of portfolio decarbonization, which is really how do they use their role as shareholders to engage with companies and say, what are you doing about it? And this is where stuff like TCFD and TNFD, which forces companies to recognize both the impacts and risks to their business. The second thing is they can sort of invest in real world decarbonization, and that, historically that's meant investing in renewables. But increasingly, they want to invest in portfolio resilience, which is how can they mitigate the risks, the climate and nature risks to their portfolio. And the way they like to do that is invest. And so it was with this sort of insight and with this movement that we felt, and having spent my own time as a pension consultant, as an asset owner, why not set up a Rebalance Earth to be a fund manager that invests in nature to provide resilience, that positions nature as infrastructure, because it's probably the easiest way to conceptualize these multiple ecosystem services that Steve and I have been talking about. And crucially, if we can get companies to pay for those valuable ecosystem services, we make it an asset class and we make it investable, and we can start to channel money into it. And so part of our theory of change is, if in the UK there's £5 trillion worth of assets today across all of our pensions and wealth systems, and that will double in the next decade to 10 trillion, what if we could get them to invest just 2%? So just £2 for every £100 in nature as an asset class. That would be enough to close this funding gap that we need to provide the climate adaptation and the nature resilience that we need here in the UK over the next decade.
Now, this next clip is a special one. Episode 17 was a celebration of our 30th anniversary at JBA Consulting. And in this clip, our founder, Jeremy Benn, reflects on the headlines, highlights, and lessons he's learned along the way, while exploring what it truly means for an organisation to be resilient.
Well, 1995 or 1994, when probably first started thinking about the original business idea, the economy wasn't doing great. We were sort of in the middle of a sort of very minor recession. But there's a lot of change going on, and also change in the air. Just to calibrate everyone to the mid 1990s, like you said, many were either not born or still at school then. There was this thing called the internet, but it wasn't being that widely used. Email was there, but you didn't spend all day email. eBay had just been established, but Google didn't come along till 1996. But you could almost sense that things were changing. Geographic information systems, we knew them. The software was there. They weren't being widely used, largely because there was just no data. You could go and buy an Esri license, but what were we going to use it on? Digital OS mapping, cost an absolute fortune. There was no LiDAR or other readily available data sets. Now, at the time, I was working in hydrology and hydraulic modelling, and also to set the context there, that wasn't really recognised as a field or an activity in its own right. So consultancies didn't have modelling teams. Consultancy would have, say, a water engineering team, and they might need modelling from time to time. You could be the highways team, might need it. So where I was working at the time, I was employed as a modeller, and I had a small team, but we didn't really have any clients of our own. We were just getting work internally. But what I had a sense is that things, could and should change, and that your modelling will develop into, a field in its own right, and also that we could integrate, modelling with new data sets, and particularly, GIS. Was it a good time to set up a business otherwise? Well, I don't think there's ever a bad time, to be honest. You could say, well, if you set up a business when times are tougher, it keeps you focused, and it means probably more resilient when if further tough times come ahead in the future. So that's a little bit about the background.
So you've been planning this, as you said, since probably '94, and was there a vision? Obviously, JBA, we've got a very established vision now, but going back 30 years, was there something that you hoped the business would become, or was it just we want to set up a new business because we see the opportunity and we can see that times are changing, which was there a sort of a longer term aspiration?
I don't think we can claim that there was any great, well thought out vision. Interesting enough, the very basic idea of having a dedicated modelling and hydrology team, we actually, we being myself and Craig Robson, actually presented to our employer at the time, who listened very politely, but that they weren't prepared to back it. I remember one comment from a partner was, a senior outline business plan, you've got one computer per person. And in those days, a decent computer to run a hydraulic model was probably about £7,000. That's at 1995 prices. And I do remember at the time as well, if they're challenging why everyone in a modelling team needs a computer, I don't think they've quite understood the concept. So I suppose that prompted us to say, well, we still think it's a good idea, so we'll do it ourselves. In terms of the vision, as I said, it was to concentrate on environmental modelling, and it was to bring together GIS models, to have technology at the heart of what we do, and innovation, and to have a focused team. I think beyond that, I think our ideas weren't that firm or set.
And finally, in this clip from episode 21, Dr. Emily Wallace, Met Office Fellow in Weather and Climate Extremes, shares with us an interesting analogy for the role the Met Office plays in building climate resilience in the UK.
Perhaps maybe then you could expand and explain a little bit further on the role that the Met Office plays in building resilience to climate extremes in the UK, perhaps in the context of some of those that sort of definition that we've just had there.
Yeah, so I'll use some slightly different wording actually. The way where I'll start is asking you to visualize a tightrope walker, and the way in which we're going to keep that tightrope walker safe. And there's I think 4 aspects really to that, which kind of project onto those areas that you've just been talking about. Often I think when climate scientists initially start thinking about resilience, they'll often go initially to robustness, so insensitivity to shocks. If you think about our tightrope walker, that might be the sort of intervention you might think about putting is I don't know, a glass tube or a solid tube around that tightrope walker, which will make the tightrope walker insensitive to gusts of wind, but kind of spoil the point, right? In the sort of climate, in the Met Office world, this might be about putting out flood calculating resilience in terms of robustness, so something like a flood defence.
Yeah.
Another way that you might think about keeping the tightrope walker safe could be about ensuring that tightrope walker is able to change easily or have flexibility. So in terms of the tightrope walker, this might be about putting a safety line on so that they can climb back onto their tightrope easily and they don't suffer too much should they fall. We can't do anything about the weather that we experience, but at the Met Office, the safety line could be thought of as our weather warning service. So it allows a community to have a response ready to go, so that they can
so that they can protect themselves should there be inclement weather. The third way we can keep our tightrope walker safer is perhaps to make sure that they have good balance. That would be something that they'd hopefully look to do early on. The Met Office, a sort of analogy with the Met Office, is the way in which we use partners and advice to support communities ahead of events. So we work, for example, with the RNLI, who provide advice around staying safe in stormy weather at the coast, which is an example of making sure that people are ready to face problematic situations and respond with agility and rapidly. It should there be a situation to deal with. The fourth type is about adaptability. So again, it might sort of defeat the object for the tightrope walker. They might decide to walk the long way round rather than go over the tightrope. Whilst that's defeating the object for the tightrope walker, in a new scenario, that could be quite valuable. So an analogy with the Met Office is we help industry to anticipate where hazards might be more likely and just to simply try and avoid them. So, for example, thinking about building of new transmission lines in the energy sector, we're working with the sector to anticipate where hazards are more likely and to help them just avoid those areas with the infrastructure where they can. So there's 4 types of resilience, or the ways in which we can create resilient systems, making them robust or insensitive to changes, making them easily changed, flexible, making them rapidly able to change, and improving their adaptability.
That's really interesting. I've just been sort of jotting down some of the key phrases there that you've mentioned: adaptability, ready to respond, safety, awareness, assessment, the use of partners, which we'll come on to. But within that sort of explanation that you've just given, then it reminded me very much of the JBA sort of simplified framework for resilience to climate change, which is aware, adapt, respond, recover. And I think that's a framework that hopefully all sectors and all practitioners can relate to, and certainly aligns with a lot of those services and support processes that the Met Office have got that you've just been explaining there. And so we've reached the end of our time today. If you've enjoyed the conversation, please hit subscribe so you're ready for our next episode in a month's time. And if you'd like to support the show, consider sharing it with others or leaving a short review wherever you're listening. It really helps more people to discover and enjoy the podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.